Hey, internets. Welcome back to my lovely basement in Canada. After a big old holiday out at the ETC, I am surrounded by my good folks and compatriots who traveled across the ocean with me, or at least a few of them. So we're going to give you a retrospective today about our experience over in Zagreb and what we took away from the ETC and what we look forward to when we go to the future. So that's the general outline of our discussion today. So with me here, first off, I want to introduce Ryan.
Hello, Internet.
Okay. And which army did you represent with us?
I was our Vermin Swarm player.
Good. And also with us at the moment is Phil.
Hello, Phil. Pleased to meet you. Hello. I played our Red Elves.
Good. And we're expecting a little bit later that we may be joined by Mike Mikas, who did our Empire of Sunstal, and perhaps Lawrence, who was our dwarf man. So to go through some things, let's talk about laying some groundworks here about our preparations. I think is where we would start when we talk about the full Zagreb experience. So from my perspective, I want to remind everybody that Matt Lau, our captain, and myself got together and started to make moves to assemble Team Canada more than a year ago. And we eventually, to jump ahead, we came to a conclusion about selecting the team by December of 2017, and then announced that to all the guys, these two fellows included. So I want to maybe ask each of you in turn, once you were announced as a teammate and a team member to go to ETC, did anything change about your gaming or hobbying habits? Ryan, what do you think?
Yeah, you know what, it for sure did. I've always been a competitive player, but it definitely pushed me to be more competitive. And I guess for me, the interesting thing about that is I had always historically been a Sylvan Elf player, but I knew that Sylvan Elves were likely to already be claimed on the team. So as soon as I knew there was a good chance I was going to make the team, I went out and started playing another army. And I just figured I had to learn the army, learn how to make a good list with it, and then play it as competitively as possible. So yeah, it did change for me because in a perfect world, playing at the competitive level of ETC, I probably would have been playing Sylvan Elves because I think if I had played that army hard, I would have been more comfortable with it. But just because of the nature of the team tournament, you had to pick up an army. So it was a good experience. And in the end, I actually really like the Vermin Swarm army, and I think I'm going to continue to make them my main going forward. But that was certainly an interesting part of the experience for me.
How about you, Phil?
Yeah, I would say there was a fair bit of a swing. I find I'm always kind of jumping between games. Not a lot of them, but different friends that play games. So once we were able to lock that in, this has kind of been on my bucket list, was playing I guess like internationally at an international event, and then again like constituting a member of Team Canada were both big things on my gaming bucket list. So I sold off kind of anything that I was doing that wasn't ninth age. And then pursued that directly. Picked up a couple extra armies just in case we needed some swap outs. And yeah, like Brian said, just kind of got in the groove of playing like something consistently. I switched between Warriors of the Dark Gods and Dread Elves quite a bit. Kind of liking both of them, I guess. Finding a little bit harder time getting familiar with the Warriors list, a little bit clunky. But yeah, then just kind of focusing on that, preparing lots of different play styles within the two.
Mm-hmm. Now, on that subject of switching between those two armies, do you feel that choice of going with the Dread Elves in the end was a team pressured choice, or was that your own familiarity choice?
Not so much pressure. I know I definitely asked for advice, and that was kind of the strong leading direction. They are inherently more efficient, I would say, and they require less synergy. I guess Warriors are not known for their synergy, but their more elite status allows them to operate, I think, more independently, which was a big ticket, and I was just finding more success. Generally, any game I play, especially competitively, I like to jump around between different armies to get a feel for what other people can do, and then to find my comfort zones. So that's not really an issue. I don't mind jumping, but I was comfortable with the Dread Elves, and I was really happy I made that decision when we were at the ETC. I think there were some matchups and some luck that I had or steered myself into that I wouldn't have been able to recover from with the Warriors, but I was able to bounce back a couple times there handily. That was good.
Okay. Ryan, anything to add to that, to those thoughts about preparations?
You know, in hindsight, I played that Vermin Swarm list a lot, or you know, different iterations of it, almost exclusively. And in hindsight, I think that was kind of a mistake in terms of practicing. And partly it's because, you know, our local group in Calgary doesn't have a big enough player base to have a huge variety of armies. You know, collectively, we probably own all the armies, but for the months leading up to ETC, we were mostly just playing each other with our ETC lists. So I played against ogres and wood elves and demons a lot in like the 3 months going up to the ETC, but I didn't play against a variety of other armies as much as I probably should have. And I think collectively as a group, we should have each taken turns playing different armies to just give ourselves some more familiarity with the other matchups.
Yeah, and that's actually something I'm going to touch on that stemmed from a conversation that I had with some other international players even before we got to the team event. So we'll come and circle back to that thought. Okay, let's talk about otherwise. Now, because we have to travel across the Atlantic Ocean to go to this thing, I'd like to get your guys' perspectives on how you prepared for that part of it, because it's not just going to a weekend tournament that's up the road in Edmonton or down the street in Calgary. So Phil, do you want to talk to that about what you got set up in advance?
Sure. Yeah. Well, we have kids at home, Stacy and I, so we had to set up somebody to look after them for the duration, and then we ended up making a trip out of it, the two of us, because we hadn't really had a vacation ourselves. So yeah, that was fairly easy. We were able to just block out enough money far in advance. Got the kids to hang out with the grandparents there, and then book time off work far enough. The 5 month planning period is quite helpful for put away a little bit of money every month. And now that we've done it once, I think it's much easier to try and conceive how much money you're going to be spending, what you're going to be throwing at it. Mm-hmm. I think looking at the other teams, like the guys like America, we've got to chat with a bit there. Slovenia, Serbia, they definitely, the repeat players seem to have like kind of a set standard or like a rhythm they got into for coming back every year. So I think I'd probably look at something like that, where you make a trip out of it every couple of years with your family, but otherwise it'd be 4 or 5 days, just a game, and then get your tickets as soon as possible. They'll probably shave your price down by about $1,500 or something, $2,000 maybe.
Yeah, maybe. And Ryan, I know you planned a European holiday as well.
Yeah, that was, well, like being married and all, that was part of the way to sell it, and to say, hey, let's go to Europe, and then we'll just tack on this tournament to it. And I mean, in a lot of ways, that's how it was. It was kind of a European trip with a couple of day diversion playing Warhammer, and I think it worked out well. But I don't think that's like a sustainable thing, that if you wanted to play this tournament every year or even every other year, that you'd necessarily do a 3-week holiday like I did. So I think some of the other teams might have it right. You just kind of go for the tournament and then tag a couple days on both sides to have a bit of a trip, but mostly make it about the tournament, because it kind of just flows better that way. I don't know, but I think if you're going to do it repetitively, that's probably how you have to do it, because I don't think either budget-wise or time-wise you can plan on going to Europe for 2 or 3 weeks every summer.
Well, I'm glad I got you two married guys here to talk about that, because I think that's an important sell for anybody that's going to go to an event like this who does have a better half. Is you got to appease the other half and justify it to go play with toy soldiers for a week. So that's good that you guys managed that okay.
I would say on that note, that definitely was not a hard sell once we got there. I was worried, like if we go to Calgary or if we go 3-4 hours away, a lot of the times family will come, and sometimes you can tell they're bored or they have something kind of hack job or ad hoc plan. But once we were there, just being in a different country was such a shock that it seemed like it was really easy for people to find stuff to occupy themselves and to have an enjoyable time while we were playing. And it was such an experience to be playing there. It really crossed over into like our evenings and dinners and whatnot. So it definitely didn't seem like a chore. Both sides of all the couples seemed pretty happy to be there.
Yeah, well, maybe speak to that on behalf of your prospective wives. I'll say my wife decided not to come because she thought that I would be completely unavailable for 5 days, which I kind of almost felt like I would be. But how did your ladies interact with that? Do you think?
Yeah,
Go ahead, Ryan.
Or sorry, you can go first.
Okay, sure. Yeah, no, we had quite a good time. I know Stacy met up with a couple of the other wives, like Ryan's wife and Mike's fiance, and they pretty much took a day excursion every day to a different place, and then went for lunch. And they were quite independent. I would say having a car was quite helpful. Then they were able to explore around, and then they still made it back to check in on us, usually once a day, and it wasn't anything out of the way or stressful or anything like that.
Yeah, and for myself, we didn't end up staying with the rest of the team, partly because the team location was a little bit remote and it wasn't necessarily close to anything. So we ended up staying kind of right downtown Zagreb, which worked out great for my wife because she could just hop out of her, Airbnb and find something to do. And exactly to your point, it's a foreign country. There's a lot of neat things that you've never seen before. You can try all the food. So initially I was actually really worried about my wife being really bored while we were there, but she actually had a great time in hindsight. So actually it didn't end up being a concern. It was actually kind of a nice part of our trip because it was a bit of a difference. Because when you're a tourist, you're trying to see everything and you're kind of go all the time. And this is even though it's go in terms of gameplay, it was more like, hey, you can go and explore because Ryan's tied down for 3 days.
Yeah, and I'm glad that Zagreb was able to accommodate that because we certainly had a pretty heavy schedule for all 3 of those days on the weekend where it was, out to the arena for 9 a.m. And then we were there till 7 p.m. and it was a meal together most nights and then back to it the next day. So I'm glad to hear that. That was really good. Okay, well, let's segue here into talking about the couple days in advance. Now, I actually arrived there on a Wednesday for the sake of having the singles event on the Thursday and Friday. Or, no, sorry. I arrived one more day ahead. Tuesday I arrived. So the singles went on Wednesday, Thursday with the team event Friday through Sunday. So the kind of things that I wanted to talk about with that was initially the thought process of why do the singles event. And I think part of the preparation stuff that you talked about, Ryan and Phil, about getting ready for that kind of style of game is I wanted to see what that style of game was. And instead of just seeing armies on paper like we did with the published lists, actually experience how they were employed on the battlefields. So there were, in fact, 6 of us, myself included as a coach, that played in the singles event. And I think I just want to talk really quickly about the overall idea of it. And that is, first, we noticed that play style was, or our army building style was very different in that it used a lot more elements. So not necessarily bulking out your infantry units to 25s and 30, but keeping them around 20 and having more mobile elements like using more chariots, using more single heroes, flying beasts, things like that. They were much more prevalent. Now, what that led to is that players, to manage all that, had to be a whole lot more precise in movement than we generally are, because you have all those elements that you need to make sure you have angles that are supporting one another, et cetera, et cetera. So that was good to encounter that. And understand how that was employed rather than just to try to, as I said before, extrapolate from just reading the Army lists. So I found some value in that. The other thing that I can tell about my tale about it is that, curiously enough, out of a field of 104 players, I had matchups against two of my Canadian partners, both Doug and Mike Bondi. Doug and I, because miraculously after the first matchup, we were the only two people in the whole entire field that had 3 points. So there was really no way to talk our way out of playing against one another. And then Mike and I, just by the way that points ended up in the fourth round, we were matched up. But what I did in both of those cases is we turned those into sort of more training and teaching things. And as a coach, what I wanted to make sure that I did in the ESC, in the singles part of it, was to make sure that my guys also had the same experiences that I was having and understand the differences of Army play. But we also, in those two games against Doug and Mike, I used it to make sure that they were stopping at as many instances as possible to reassess the damage, reassess the game state, and take into account the possibilities. So one good story that I have coming out of this is Mike Bondi, who is our guy playing the Ogre Kingdoms. We got to a point in our game where he had the unfortunate moment of his big Ogre block with well over 1,000 points put into it, fled off the field just due to a panic test. And he was ready to throw the game. Like, he was ready to fold up and do it and give up 20 points and say we're done. But I was able to talk him through that moment and have him press on with the idea that, you know what, you can't give up 20. You have to, at this point, go into preservation mode. As it turned out, later in that game, it pivoted again, and the game looked very different after some sword masters ran into his, I think it was his Rock Auroch, and whiffed it. They chased down that unit, or the Rock Auroch chased down that unit because of all my whiffing, and that was another 1,000-point swing the other way. So it ended up to be an 11-9 victory to me instead of a 20-0 victory to me. And so that was a good teaching moment that I'm really glad that we had in that singles event. So for me, that was the best part to come out of the singles event. Do you, either of you two guys, have any things to share from the other guys that discussed that singles with you? Ryan, any thoughts?
Well, I didn't play singles, but I got to Zagreb on the Wednesday night, so that was after day one of the singles, and I got in super late because I had been kind of touring another part of Europe before that, and my flight was delayed and all that fun stuff. But I noticed, particularly talking to a couple of the guys, the intimidation level was fairly high, which kind of surprised me at the time. It still kind of does, because having played the team component, I didn't really feel intimidated at any particular point. I kind of, these guys are good generals. They know the rules. They know the matchups. But certainly, I think there was a bit of a shock on day one, just kind of how big the venue was, playing on terrain that we're not necessarily used to, playing, consistently high quality opponents, whereas at home that's not necessarily always true. There's more of a curve, whereas I think here, for the most part, we had consistently quality component of opponents who knew the rules. So I think maybe that was a bit surprising. And yeah, I guess the part about terrain as well. In hindsight, I really love playing on 2D terrain. I know it kind of reduces the immersion factor a little bit, but man, it's so much nicer to move on that stuff. And I think you just got to, I never had any problems discerning what a particular piece of terrain was, but I heard horror stories of day one. For example, Matt thought of ruins was a building, and that one particular ruins kind of looks like a building. I know myself, since I've played on online quite a bit, I know that what the terrain pieces look like, but unfortunately Matt made a mistake. He thought it was a building, turns out it was ruins, and he was not behind cover that he thought he was. So it was a bit of a learning curve, but I think when you get used to that 2D mousepad terrain, it's really nice to play on. if you don't mind that it doesn't look as nice.
Yeah. Phil, did you feel you had any gotcha moments with that 2D trade?
Not really, no. Yeah, I found I was a little bit neurotic probably the first 2 games, just double checking 5 times that on the sheet on the side, just verifying like, yep, this is this. Yep, this is this. But no, I agree with Ryan where it was for competitive play and for ease of use. It was excellent for measuring, keeping everything flat. A lot of my stuff is a lot of heavy metal objects, and I get paranoid about dropping them. But yeah, I agree. The immersion factor definitely lacks quite a bit. A lot of the comments I was hearing from the teams we were playing was that they should at least have impassable buildings be 3D structures, so it's really easy to tell those ones apart, and it's not like you can put models on them anyway. So that might be a nice way to swing that. But yeah, I can see why the War Machine guys like it at the very top echelons. It led for 0 discrepancy, 0 fighting about stuff. I had no arguments come up whatsoever in all 6 games for me.
Yeah, I felt that in one of the games that I was playing in the singles, I made a similar mistake. I was moving up to occupy some ruins in the center of the field and use that as a sort of a fire base for a bunch of archers. And then as I was making my move into it, the guy reminded me that is in fact an impassable building.
Oh shoot! So you did the same thing or the opposite.
Right? Yeah. So a similar mistake in representation, but for the opposite result.
Some of those ruins look like buildings, and some of those buildings look like ruins. And I mean, you see them enough times, okay, that one's obviously a ruin. But if it was your first time, I could see how you could make that mistake. Unfortunately.
Yeah, and I agree with you there. I think if you repeatedly played with that stuff, then it would become second nature. But being the first time that most of us had played in that, it caught a couple of us out. Here's something else to think about. There was a couple of opportunities where other teams reached out to me in advance of the event to ask if we wanted to do a practice round on either that Wednesday or the Thursday before the team event. So if we were to launch into that again, do you think that from your perspective, you two guys, would you have preferred to have that opportunity and forego potentially playing in the singles to do that kind of team matchup?
I think looking ahead at like a next year kind of thing, I definitely would. I would probably set aside a full day. I know Serbia had mentioned when we were there saying like, let's meet up and let's practice next time. I would probably just commit one the day before to getting like 3, 4, 4 quick games in where we're kind of banging it out back and forth real fast, or like 3 kind of actual structured games. And that way you're nice and warmed up. Your head's in the right place. You're moving your pieces nice and confidently, kind of idea. Instead of having the stress of trying to do your best, I'd rather kind of save it and do my best and think tactically over the 3 days. I know 2 of our strongest players there were saying that they were having some serious fatigue and burnout day 5 and day 6, or sort of 4 and 5.
I would agree. I didn't play the singles, so I can't really speak to fatigue. But I think the matchup part is something that collectively as a team we hadn't practiced enough and we weren't prepared for enough. And having had the opportunity to play 1 or 2 team games where you went through that matchup process would have been helpful, especially for beginners. But I even think for seasoned teams, just kind of having the opportunity to do that pairing process and refresh it in your mind would have been helpful, especially that the end of that pairing process is not very intuitive, and it takes doing it a couple times to really get a feel for like how the last 3 or 4 matchups are determined.
Yeah. Well, on that subject, actually, Ryan, that's a good segue. Let's now flip ahead to the team event, and I want to sort of open it up, talking about the team event itself. And I'm going to, while we do this, if I can, I want to do some screen share and show us our tourney keeper. Do you guys have that up on the screen? Do you see tourney keeper?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're going to show the embarrassing.
Well, it has to be done.
No, I'm kidding.
So I'm gonna lock onto my screen so that it'll stay here while you guys are talking. But I think what I want to say to open up is, and exactly carrying on with what Ryan was saying, is the thing that we never really had the opportunity to do is do a full 8 versus 8 matchup process. We had done a couple team events, which Phil had run, and we had elsewhere we were doing 4 players or 3 players and that kind of thing, and trying to get better matchups. But it was certainly a bigger deal when you have a spectrum of 8 to deal with. We had a full week ahead of time to know who our opponent was going to be in the first round, so we didn't have to just learn it right there within a half an hour. But it was Team Spain that we played up against, and we had a chance to look over all the army lists. We had all you guys prepare a matrix, which I don't have available to share here, but the matrix, effectively, for anybody that's done ETC or team events will probably understand the concept that we have everybody get a sense of what matchups that they feel good, bad, or neutral against. And we use that as a basis for when we go into actually choosing the matchups to try to make sure that we get as many green or yellow and not red if we can, and those being the good, neutral, and bad. What I saw, and I'll maybe expound upon this a little bit later, is that other teams in their prep were actually nailing it down to, I expect to get this many points, not just mid, high, or low expectation. So looking at the way that this matched up here on the screen, you can see my cursor around here. Let's talk Phil Harlow's here first. Here at the top of this list. I know that it says Warriors the Dark Gods on people's screen, but that was not the case. Phil, tell me about this matchup.
Yeah.
Was it one?
All right.
Was it one that you had marked as a dreaded one?
Yeah. The my whole kind of list structure, list planning scenario was making sure that I got first swing, or at least better swing off on somebody else. I was getting a lot of feedback from friends that play elf armies, and they were saying just make sure that you're getting first digs in, because you can't take a punch and come back from it in a lot of cases. And I thought the Pablo gentleman was like a junior player kind of idea. He seemed like very fresh faced and like new and stuff. And I was like, oh, good, like someone more my speed that maybe is a little newer to the game. And then no, I quickly learned he was a top tier. I think one of the number 1 or 2 vampire players in the world. So it was a big learning experience. I found he was always 3 steps ahead for myself, which was exciting to see, somebody that knew their stuff that well. And then whenever I was able to kind of shoehorn a little bit of a moral victory or a little bit of a win every turn or two, it was when all of his pieces, and I just let him down. He'd fail three spells or something in a phase, and then I'd allow me to do something. So in hindsight, now that I've played a lot more undead since I've been back purposefully, I think I would have a whole different mindset going in. But yeah, it was a good first game to get slapped around a little bit. I'd been too used to playing and doing too well, maybe here at home in our smaller pool, and so it was a really good eye opener. I really had to readjust after that.
Yeah. Well, looking down the rest of the results list here, let's turn to our shining star in this matchup, Ryan Joseph Freiberger.
Yeah. My name ended up displaying funny on this thing, and I could never change it, so I'm stuck with it, I guess. Yeah, a tie got me the best results on the team. That's kind of sad, but in this game, I actually got a good matchup, one that I was looking for. And I'd like to say that I should have won better if I was a bit unlucky, or if I was a bit more lucky. But there's a couple moments in that game where I was pretty lucky, so maybe I shouldn't complain. But it was looking like a pretty big victory for me early on. This is a funny story that I'll never forget. So I was playing Vermin Swarm. I had Divination on my Vermin Demon, and of course he had the Big Bird Thaumaturgy caster. And of course that caster is super vulnerable to Divination. But I think the first time he made himself in front of me so I could cast a spell on it, I put Fate's Judgment on him, which is the boosted version where it's D6 wounds. And so I roll how many wounds? 6. Okay, well, there's no ward saves, but he still gets a 5 of armor save. He rolls the 6 dice, fails every single one of them. Big Bird is dead. So it was when that happened on like turn 2 or 3, I should have just played a little bit more conservatively because I already had the victory in the bag. But I tried to play a little bit more aggressively and get a 20-0, and it ended up backfiring. And he made some smart decisions to minimize the damage. Because, in hindsight, it was a good matchup for me because the likelihood of his big wizard general surviving that game was very limited. I had both the cannon and the divination magic, and he just didn't really have the tools to stop me. But I think I got a bit too aggressive to force a big win, and him being a really smart player, he got me. I was a bit unlucky in the end, so the dice kind of balanced out after getting his Big Bird. Yeah.
So to nail down something you passed over there is what I was curious to learn about from essentially the European style of play or the ETC style of play. What did you notice about how this guy Jesus played it to try to back off and preserve points after things went bad?
Actually, in his case, he didn't try and back off and preserve points. He forced the issue on the flanks. So I had kind of, I mean, it's been a while, so I can't remember the game anymore. But he made a bit of a risky charge, I'd say, by putting his Crushers into my Thunderhawks. Statistically, he should probably win, so I wouldn't say it's risky, but he just capitalized on all my small units, which in hindsight was, my list wasn't as optimal as it could or should have been. I had a lot of soft points to give away between my weapons teams, the foot pads, the Thunderhawks. They're just pretty easy points to take. And even most of my games, my Vermin Demon survived, my Pendulum unit survived, but all the other stuff died. And, so he just went and beat up on all my small stuff that he could do fairly easily. And I think maybe he got secondary objective in the end. I can't remember off the top of my head anymore. But yeah, he just played smart, and he picked up he found the weakness in my list, even with his big caster dead, and beat up on me that way. And really what I should have done in that situation, getting his 1,200 point general, is hit everything else and said, hey, come at me. You have to get through my pendulum to get to the rest of my points. And I just didn't do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, let's bottom line this for people at home. So you're going to see a couple scores up here near my cursor right now. So out of available 160 points, 20 points times 8 games, the Spanish took 131 of those, meaning we only had 29. Ryan had 10 of those 29. So bravo again, Ryan. But you'll see this score, 100 to 60. That's because they capped this for the sake of seeding the future rounds. So anyway, as Phil said, a very eye-opening round 1. Let's move on to round 2, shall we?
Sure. Do you intend to kind of go through every game like this? Because if we do, it's going to take a while. I mean, I'm good with that, but I don't know how. I remember the first game very well.
We don't need to go through it in all that kind of detail.
Okay.
But let's go to the next matchup.
All right, let's do it.
So next we played the United States, which I'll tell you from my perspective, I was kind of relishing this matchup because we had talked about different goals of where we'd finish in this kind of thing. And my hope was that we would finish best of any American team. And that meant that our opposition would have been USA, Mexico, and Argentina, technically. So because we played the USA, I thought this was an opportunity to show our dominance. So I would say from the coach perspective, first off, that we obviously learned a couple of things about the matchup process a little bit better from our first situation. And I feel that we got better matchups in this one than we did the first time around. That obviously showed for Mr. Harlos, who flipped it on its head and got a much better result. Ryan, did you going into this initially feel that against Phil? You played on, he was the Undying Dynasties one, wasn't he?
Yeah, so this wasn't a great matchup for me. So I mean, but I don't. It's hard to say the whole team can't get good matchups. You know, kind of speaking of overall strategy for a moment, I think one of the problems with our matrix is, yeah, we ranked everything good, medium, bad, but we didn't really define what any of those things meant. So what good meant to Matt versus what good meant to me might not have been the same thing. And so I think we did run into some issues like that. And we should have probably predefined it, saying, you know, a good means that you have a really good chance of getting a 15 points or better, and you're comfortable with that matchup. And I think in a lot of times I was putting good for like a game I was projecting 12-8 when I really shouldn't have. And maybe we can speak to this more at the end, but I think it's partly because we didn't have enough lists that hard countered other things. So in this case, no one wanted to play that Undying Dynasties list. And I said, well, you know, it's a more medium matchup for me. I can try it. And, you know, in hindsight, it probably actually was a poor matchup for me from the beginning. So I hadn't played against it enough to really have a good feel for it. But yeah, it was a bad matchup for me from the beginning. And I think collectively as a team, if we do this again, we have to spend more time on that matrix and kind of have better understanding of what good, medium, bad really means for everybody.
Yeah, and I think that's what I've learned from my hobnobbing with other captains, is they in fact did have their players nailed down to, I expect to score 12 points in this, or 15, or 2, or whatever it might be, right? So yeah, I think we would do that with a little bit more care next time around. Phil, do you have any thoughts about your Bretonian matchup here?
Yeah, definitely. Bretonians or Equitane were one of the ones I was hoping for. I was really, when I was filling out the matrix and building my list, planning on armies that had to come to me and engage me. I built my army so that I was able to prioritize on their needing to engage, so I could be the first one to swing in most of those engagements. It really paid off. After coming off that first game, thinking I'm a terrible player and I don't know what I'm doing, and it was maybe, I think, like bottom half of the first turn, I was like, oh no, this is I'm in my element here. I'm comfortable. I'm playing against somebody that I've planned to play against, or a style, and I've got all the pieces that I need, and it was a very welcome feeling, I guess, to kind of bounce back like that. I did find, though, a point on our matrix was that it was always like kind of constantly developing on the fly. Whereas I had maybe pegged myself as a fair in it, maybe after 2 games and getting some more legs under me experience-wise, playing against different things, a fair might turn to a good, and a lot of my really goods were backpedaled to fairs, just seeing how some different people were using armies that I thought would be easy picks for me, in very extravagant ways or in very exotic ways. So I was really having to deal with just their level of expertise, which wasn't a bad thing. It was an eye-opener. But I noticed a lot of us were changing our matchups quite a bit day 2 and day 3 in the matchup process.
I think that's a very good point. I agree with that as well. I think partly it just speaks to the fact that we maybe didn't practice against a large enough variety of opponents consistently. And for myself, particularly against Team USA, I thought this Undying Dynasty matchup wasn't bad for me. But then when we put the models on the table and played it out, I was like, oh yeah, no, I probably should have lost that game, and I should have expected to. I thought I could force a draw, and maybe with a bit more luck, it would have been a bit tighter. But it was a bad matchup for me from the beginning, and I just didn't know it.
Well, if I can speak to that from a coach perspective, I think that if I was to think back on it now, when you guys filled out the matrix, or I shouldn't say you guys, but in general, when the team filled out the matrix, they just looked at, okay, well, how do I do against dwarfs? Well, that's good. I'm good against dwarfs. So all the dwarf lists, mark them green. And all the Ogre Kingdoms lists, well, I'm shitty against those, so mark them all red. And I think that was just too general. And I think, in fact, looking at this matchup right here, Matt, who played against Ryan here. Ryan was an Ogre Kingdoms guy, but he had a pretty wild Ogre Kingdoms army. He had vanguarding mammoth hunters that he launched ahead with his dogs or his saber cats, and then split them off and got all messy up in Matt's line like turn one and right away. And that was just a big sort of bullet that came through Matt's lines that he likes to buy a few turns before he engages, and he just wasn't capable. So I think that was a perfect example of, you can't just generally say, well, Sylvan Elves are going to be good against ogres, but actually look a lot closer and to see what that composition of that army is.
It's an interesting point. And, you know, myself, I spent a lot of time looking at the different army lists. Like, I didn't just say, hey, this ogres, this is a matchup for me. I looked at magic items, and it was partly for me trying to learn the rest of the armies out there.
Mm-hmm.
But in hindsight, I think instead of spending so much time looking at lists, I would have almost rather played more games against more stuff, because sometimes they play differently than they are on the table. But also, I for the whole tournament, I didn't get a lot of good matchups. Like, I built my whole army to play against elves, and I thought I could beat pretty much any elf army out there, generally speaking. And I didn't get elves a single time. So all this kind of preparing to play elves didn't actually work out for me. But maybe if I had spent more time playing, you know, non-elves, it would have been a better use of my time.
Yeah, maybe. All right. So at the end of the first day then, so you can see these scores again, as we did have a couple good wins in that round, but still not enough to break the bubble of that cap. So regrettably, my dreams of being the best North American team was slipping away at us here, and then we ended day one with those two losses, but a marked improvement from first round to second round, I would say. So let's move ahead to day two, and this is where we played the Argentines. Here we are, day three, or that says round three. You can see immediately the result was better. We came a whole lot closer to getting victory in that one. The other thing that I took away from this one, just as a overarching perspective, is everybody scored points in this one, right? We didn't have any shutouts or any zeros. So that meant to me that we were starting to adapt and learning to preserve points and play within that balance. So that pleased me first off from that perspective. Anything unique in these matchups that you guys wanted to talk about, Phil?
Yeah, sure. So I had practiced against yourself there, Kieran. I think 2-3 weeks beforehand, you'd played a kind of a similar high elf list to this one, utilizing like pyromancy, a lot of spearman blocks.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was a good experience and was feeling fairly comfortable. I guess maybe 2 points here. First point is it's I had watched one or two of our players getting kind of frustrated the day before. They're making all the right decisions, all the right moves on paper, and you know, sometimes things just don't work out. And I was having trouble kind of relating to that. And then in this game specifically, I was trying to utilize first turn usually, because that's I'm more comfortable like that. I can get a little bit of a leg up or some mobility. And he had pulled first turn and had I think it was an 8 card pyromancy phase, getting all spells off and me stopping none. And then round 2 was a 7 card phase, same thing. I think I stopped 1 out of 4, and it just rocked me real bad. I was kind of playing catch up for the whole time after that, trying to just kind of squadron off little bits and pick up small points. So I got a little bit too tilted there, I think. But at the same time, I was definitely understanding how everybody had felt the previous day, you know, kind of saying that you're just kind of stuck on a spot and you got to do the best you can. So that was the first situation of the week for me in that regard. Mm-hmm. Is a big eye opener. And then also by this point, I was definitely feeling much more comfortable though with my spell selection. The team had kind of pushed me to take Witchcraft, which I had only actually played once before we went to ETC. I went over to Doug's house and played 2 games. And I tried the Witchcraft path once and then didn't do very well with it, so I swapped back to Cosmology. and was feeling confident with that. But by the third game in, I was really happy that I had taken it, and I was just kind of finding my legs underneath me in that regard.
Okay, good. And Ryan, how about you? Any thoughts about this mirror matchup that you had?
Yeah, this is I can't remember this game a lot, and I played a couple mirror matchups this weekend. So I think this one we're both. I just checked his list, and we were both rocking Vermin Demons. So really, what this comes, and we had very similar lists. He had the double Dreadmill, but I had the cannon and the catapult. And like with this becomes a divination off. Like whoever can get the lucky volley with their divination magic off that kills the other guy's general, because both of us are super vulnerable to divination. And I think I eked out the win because I got his general, and I don't think he got mine. I think after I got his general, which admittedly was lucky because I think we both threw some bombs at each other with, when you're rolling divination, you're either going to get unerring strike or fate's judgment, and both of them can come close to one-shotting a vermin demon, or realistically we're talking about 2 or 3 shots. And I managed to get his first, and then after that he got lucky to get the game as close as he did, because I think he like one-shotted my pendulum with a doom wheel, or so I guess it wouldn't be a one-shot but 2-shot. I'm pretty sure I had like a 3 aboard save and I failed it, but yeah, this wasn't a great matchup for me, even though I won, because it's so random. Whoever gets the general will win the game first, and that's pretty much all there's to it.
Right. Okay. Well, the other overarching thing that I wanted to ask you guys about here was we learned that all these fellows who are representing Team Argentina were actually Spanish residents, so they didn't actually come from across the world. But I wanted to ask you guys, how did you feel about language at the tables at this point in the event? Because you had two Spanish-speaking teams and 1 English-speaking team. How'd you feel about that overall, even not just those 3?
Yeah, I never had an issue for the whole tournament. I can't say I had one bad opponent, or bad is the wrong word. One opponent whose English wasn't good enough. Like every opponent I played had good English, and even if they didn't know the exact word for that thing, sometimes they'd ask their teammate and be like, "I'm trying to say this. What is the English word?" Or we just point and we'd figure it out. But I can't say that caused me grief in any single game.
Okay, and Phil, how about you?
Yeah, I'd say about the same. I think in this game there was maybe a point we got hung up on maybe for about 20 minutes, trying to figure out something. I noticed a lot of the players did not bring rule books, which I found was a little bit frustrating, or army lists. So in this case, there was a high elf specific rule that he was referring to. We were struggling between the two of us to relate what exactly he meant and what exactly I was asking. And he didn't have any papers to kind of to prove it or show it. So we ended up bogging down for a bit, but getting clarification from our coach and his coach, and then it was fine after that. But this is probably the only time in the weekend that I guess it really impacted time-wise. We still finished under the time limit, but like Ryan said, I didn't really have any complaints. Everybody was pretty cordial and had a good concept or a good grasp of English, much more readily than they'd need to play a game.
And to take a step back for a second and talk about the whole mercenary concept of, I didn't realize not a single one of these guys is from Argentina, but you know what, it's fine. And I think for Team Canada going forward, if we want to put a team together every year, I think it's something that we might have to do ourselves, is to pick up a couple mercenaries, because I think deep down the likelihood of getting 8 people to spend thousands of dollars to go to Europe every single year may or may not be realistic given the community that we have. I mean, we should certainly try, but if we can get 6 people next year and then pick up a couple mercenaries, we should absolutely go, because I think having a presence there is so good for our community that even if a couple people are not local, who cares? Let's just put a team together.
Yeah, and we can come talk about that at the sort of end of it all again, when we talk about future plans. But yeah, good point there. To elaborate on what Ryan's saying, everybody at home, is that the standard of the ETC is you got to have 4 people on your team of 8 that have either current residence or grandfathered in citizenship. So in other words, because my grandfather was born in England and my dad was as well, I could technically play for Team England, even though I've never lived there for more than 8 months at a time in my lifetime. And similarly, a Swedish guy who currently lives in Serbia can certainly play on Team Serbia and those kinds of things. So it's a little bit loose that way. And then you can fill, I guess, half your team with anybody from anywhere, like Team Mexico did. Team Mexico technically has nobody that's lived in Mexico, but they can trace some history there, and they added on others. Anyway.
Yeah, sorry to derail things.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go to round 4. This is where we played the Serbians, and I think at this point, my general feeling is we were feeling pretty good because we had our best result so far, scoring 70 points. And I think that our attitudes in general seemed to me, watching you guys, seemed a little bit looser about things. And so going into this game against the Serbians, who also kind of came at us, and their approach was pretty loose as well, and their attitude when we did the matchup process anyway. We got into the games feeling that our result would be pretty good, but the results showed that we slipped a little bit in some spaces. We gave up another few instances of back to 0 scores in 3 different games, even though we had some good results in a couple. We had a little more swings. Do you guys have anything remarkable out of this matchup against the Serbians you want to talk about?
This is my best result on the weekend. And you know what's funny is I put this up as a medium matchup. And again, this goes to show we need to more practice ahead of time. Because as soon as we put the stuff on the table, I was like, oh, I'm going to win this game. Like I just from turn 1, I was like, he's got no tools to deal with me. Because he had an Orkin Goblin gun line. But he really just didn't have the ability to break my bricks up enough before I could get to him. And I think maybe at the beginning, first turn, I got a bit lucky too, but it was a great matchup for me, and I had put it as medium. So again, more practice.
Phil, the thing that I noticed about this game that I remember is that I proudly watched on the sidelines as you employed I think you coined the phrase, the garter snake maneuver with your fast cavalry.
Yeah.
You want to talk about how you employed that in this game?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I had seen it in the previous game versus the High Elves, where he just I called it the shitty garter snake, where just you run your fast cav up an inch away, and instead of facing, you spice them out single file across the whole front of their army, which for ogres was amazing because it blocked. He had three large things of bombardiers, and it blocked fully line of sight on one of them, and then his main combat block couldn't do anything. So I was able to come in from the flanks and really pick off a lot of stuff. I really enjoyed this game because Vladimir was super laid back, fun guy, and he was also like a big community presence. He's kind of the pillar of their community there, and he had been previously on the chair, I believe. And it was really nice to just sit and visit and kind of shoot the shit and play per se with somebody that's kind of how I strive to be here at home. That was quite enjoyable. And by this time too, I'd been put up against so many shooting armies, which I was hoping to not play, that I was getting pretty comfortable with what to do and what not to do. So yeah, it was really good round.
Okay. Good. But yeah, I think that what I noticed out of that, and the reason I wanted you to highlight that point, is I think we were at this point really displaying an adaptation to play style that everybody had sort of picked up pieces of over the weekend. So I was happy to see that in action.
I think by this point in time, we had also accepted our fate that we weren't winning this thing. Not that I thought we were going to ever win this thing, but we kind of just accepted that, oh, okay, well, we're going to be on the bottom tables for the rest of this thing, and we're going to try our best to pull out a couple team wins. But we had accepted that it wasn't going to be our weekend, so to speak. So maybe that made everybody more a little bit comfortable and calm down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that ended day 2 against the Serbians, and then we had our Saturday night out and came back to it the next morning. And then we played Slovenia. My memory out of this one was when we sat down to do the matchup process itself. The guys presented a bottle of schnapps on the top of the table at 8:30 in the morning and said, "We start with this, and then we fight on the battlefield," which was wonderful. And I think that this is where I want to interject a little bit of the feelings that I had about the camaraderie of this event overall. Tagging on what you just said, Ryan, is we were down at the back end of things and had been since the previous day. And therefore, there was nothing super edgy about our gameplay. We weren't at stake for the championship. So although we still wanted to represent well, we weren't clawing and fighting or being jackasses to one another or our opponents for the sake of getting a leg up. And this really kind of came to a top here with the Slovenian guys that we were there as an international camaraderie to play in a game that we all enjoyed together. So that's what I felt. It was a real strong thing here. Anything about your matchups you wanted to touch on, guys, in these instances? No? If not, that's okay.
This was another mirror matchup for me. And it's, again, super swingy. This one, he didn't have divination, but he had a bunch of chaff and a bunch of shooting. And so it just it's really swingy. We think we had a cannon off, and my cannon couldn't kill his cannon. And so he kind of pulled me apart. I got a bit unlucky, I feel like I'm going to say here. This is my worst result all weekend. But yeah, another matchup I didn't want and tried to make the best of it. I think there was a few moments in that game where I could have won, but the luck just wasn't my way.
This one was a very unconventional army list for my opponent. His empire had a whole bunch of skirmishing units, kind of layered over top of each other like a net, which was a lot of fun to play through. But I kept getting distracted by the table next to ours, which was Kevin and Rock, their captain. Because I really enjoy Warriors of the Dark Gods. And then when someone had mentioned that he had written the majority of the army book, I thought, I wanted to match up because I thought I would do quite well against his Juggernaut spam list. And B, I wanted to see somebody who had been integral in creating a book or writing a book and then see them play their army on the table. I thought that would be just a phenomenal experience. But my opponent was much too good for me to take too much time away from the game to kind of gaze over on their side. It was a lot of fun, really close. It came down to a secondary swing, and I think that was kind of best case scenario. I was glad that neither of us got stomped out. We were both playing really clean and really, really hard.
Yeah, and that's a good pickup, Phil. The other part about this, leading on to the social aspect of it, is being that this Ninth Age has become an international job for a lot of people, and pulling people from all kinds of different nations to work on the game. It really is kind of cool to bump into those people that have had a deeper investment into the development of it, like Rock and Vladimir, who you spoke of earlier, and a couple other guys along the way who've played a big part in getting the game to this point. The other quick thing I want to touch on here before we move on to the last matchup is the experience of negotiating results. And what I mean by that is, in this matchup here, Lawrence was facing off against Miha, who was doing vampire counts. And they actually agreed ahead of time that they weren't going to engage. Like, they had a discussion pre-game and said, you know what, you're dwarfs, you're a gun line, I'm undead, I'm over here. I'm not gonna be able to reach out and zap anything from you of any significance. So why don't we just agree on a draw? And that actually happened twice in a row because Lawrence did the very same thing against Darko in the Serbian matchup up here, the one before. And I thought this was an interesting thing. I knew that it was a possibility, and as a coach, we kind of talk about it, and we have that negotiation with the other coach, and we say, you agree with this? Does that seem okay? And so we can let that be. We didn't have that discussion with any of your games that you two guys were involved in, but there was a couple of others that conversation came up. And I thought I'd just put that out there, not to say too much about it, but just to say that for people watching at home, that's a possibility. And sometimes that mutual agreement can happen with these ETC matchups.
I think that's only a possibility because we were kind of at the bottom tables. If we were if we were in a meaningful position to impact the standings, I'd kind of have a problem with that because you got to play the game. And I know partly it was because they're playing lists that are just diametrically don't engage. And so part of the appeal of that agreement was, hey, let's agree it's 10-10 and then just go actually have a fun game and try and fight each other. Whereas, hey, let's stay back and not do anything. But, I feel like if we were in a meaningful position and our opponents were in a meaningful position, you can't do that. You got to play the games for the integrity of the tournament. So,
well, I have two thoughts on that actually, Ryan, and that is that was happening at mid-tables too. Like I know that I had conversations with the Netherlands guys and Mexico and Scotland, and they were all mid-range or the Scotland guys were a little bit higher, and they had come to a couple of these agreements. I think the reason it happens is because both parties feel like they might be on the bottom end of it, and they don't want to risk being on the bottom end of it. And I think that's why they bring it up. Right?
Yeah.
So they might feel that it's going to be close, but I might only get 7 or I might only get 8 if I don't agree on a 10. And if the other guy also feels the same sentiment, then that's why they would come to that agreement. I wanted to add to that as we move on and segue to the last matchup. I want to highlight this one that Mike Mikas had against Tomislav. The way that the train was laid out is this Kingdom of Aquitaine player hid behind a hill, and it was a breakthrough scenario, and he just wasn't willing to come out and expose himself to all of Mike's shooting. So Mike actually came to me and he said, this guy wants to agree on a 10-10. And I said, well, I came over and looked at the table and I looked at the example. And I said, well, yeah, you could maybe agree on that if he's just going to park it and not come to you and you're not going to go to him. But let me look at it this way. Mike, you're the only guy that's got a chance of running a unit across the field and scoring that secondary objective. So I think if you're to negotiate anything here, you negotiate a 13-7. And the guy agreed to that. So that's another example of negotiating for something that we thought was beneficial. Now, could it have been that if the guy really parked and did nothing, that it would have only been a 10? Yes. Could it have been a much bigger swing in Mike's favor if he tried to press the advantage? Maybe. But that was one of those negotiations that we collectively came to an agreement on, and all sides were happy.
I think that's kind of a cool experience in itself. Just the size and the structure of the event, that you can have things like that happening, things like that popping up. That's something I've never experienced here, like a local tournament.
Mm-hmm. But I guess the final thing to say about this matchup, of course, is this happy number right here.
We won.
We finished on top of the barometer. Not a huge sweeping victory, but a victory just the same. And thank goodness, like after 6 games of this, and learning all that we did, and having the experiences that we did, we certainly felt, or at least I felt, wonderful that we came away with at least 1 out of 6 from this weekend. How about you guys? What are your thoughts about either of the matchups you played here to finish off, or that last point?
It was a really disappointing last day for me because coming into this point, I was 2-1-1, and my goal was to finish at least above 500. So I needed to win one of these 2 games to kind of do what I wanted to do, and I dropped both of them. And this game was the last game in particular was super tight. And now that I look at this again, it's funny. I didn't get a single matchup I wanted all weekend, except for game one. Game one, I got the matchup I wanted. Every other time, I got medium to poor, which is kind of interesting. I don't think I realized that was so bad, because this last game is another super swingy matchup because he has divination, I have divination. Whoever gets a divination off, and it's a really it's an interesting thing that happened to me a lot this weekend. And so I think he got a bit lucky to get my demon before I got his, but I mean that's the way divination works, unfortunately, and that's the game. So it's just interesting that when I kind of look at all my matchups for the week, or I guess the 3 days, I had one that I was happy with going into it. And of course, the Orc and Goblin game in hindsight was a good matchup, but I didn't think it at the time.
Yeah, and to speak to that a little bit, Ryan, we at a couple of times in the matchups, and I think that which one was it? I think it was for sure this one, Slovenia. Luca was playing
the Vermin Swarm.
Yeah, he was playing Vermin Swarms as well. I think we made the conscious decision that we would put you in there being the stronger player, because we had heard word that this guy was also their strongest player, like as far as just generalship. So we thought that you had performed well enough earlier in this weekend that you would be adaptable enough to counter that. So although we agree with you that wasn't your best matchup, we thought that you would be able to mitigate.
Yeah.
And so that was part of our, I just want us to share that, not just for you, but for anybody watching at home too, that's also part of what you have to do during the matchup process. And even though that you're putting somebody into a bad place, you hope that their generalship will overcome some of that. And we had to do that a couple times.
So that's an interesting observation. I think it's true. And I think playing a team tournament of this size, and by size, I mean the amount of players per team, where in contrast to our local ones, which I think the biggest have been 4, there's just a lot of more possibilities and a lot more hard counters. And whereas a local team tournament where you have 3 or 4 people, you still almost have to bring an all-comers list. For this type of tournament, you don't. And in fact, that's almost a detriment. So I think going forward, if we were to ever do this again, we need to bring a little bit more unbalanced lists, so to speak, that can do really well. And I know we were kind of talking about this before we went on air, but I think when you're building a team for a tournament of this size, you almost need to say, hey, we need like 3 lists that can just crush armor. We need 2 or 3 lists that can deal with monsters, and then 2 or 3 lists that can deal with hordes, and then 2 or 3 lists that can do with MSU. And I realize you add all that up and you get to 10 or 12, so that doesn't quite work. But you need to be strategic with your list building and have lists that can maybe be both anti-MSU and anti-armor at the same time. And I think as a team, we didn't do that enough. So we didn't necessarily always get those crushing matchups that you ideally need to get your max points per game.
Okay. Yeah, well, let's I'm going to pull off the screen sharing now and come back to us live. Yeah, so let's segue that into talking about first of all a little bit of after the event. What have you guys done playing wise since coming back home with this ETC experience in mind? Phil, anything much different about how you prepare?
Yeah, I definitely I bought 3 more armies, I guess, in preparation for learning and possibilities open up. Just excited, just real. I know our fun league kicked off as soon as we got back, and I've noticed everybody that was kind of like lurking or like watching our exploits from afar seemed to be pretty fired up. So I'm really enjoying the wave of hobby enthusiasm that's been unleashed here. For myself, I'm still working on my warriors and my dread elves. Kind of pumping out units for both, and I'm still bouncing between the two. I'm using a lot of the up. Looking at gameplay quite a bit different, I guess, even in like the fun games that we play. I'm really watching other players, kind of seeing what they're doing, trying to get an idea of what their mindset is behind the decisions they make. Whereas before, I think I was a little newer to fantasy, so I was more of a reactive player. I definitely found over the course of our 6 games that when I did, I guess to touch on what Ryan was saying about matchups, when I did get the matchups that I had imagined or planned for, I did very well, which was a good feeling. And I think he's right that we need to be able to have 2 to 3 lists to throw up for each kind of scenario, whether it's undead or armor or monsters or whatnot. And then when they pull you out of those 2 and then you don't get chosen, you need to have another backup slot that you are very good at, or at least 2 more that you're fairly good at. And that was just something that we did not do, is to tailor. But for myself, I'm just preparing for, we got a couple events this fall, and I'm hoping to, just keep the games days going, keep the competitive play in mind, and just keep getting better here, keep helping other people around us get better.
Right. Actually, before I come to you, Ryan, I want to come back on something I missed that I think is worth mentioning, and that is, despite our performance on the battlefield, I did a different video about this, but I want to mention it here too, is that we, as Team Canada, were nominated as one of only 4 teams to be the best painted as a team. So I felt a good sense of hobby pride in that, and it was a little bit of a sort of a pseudo win for a thrashing on the battlefields that we took over the weekend. We did not win out of that nomination of 4. That was Team Montenegro that took that one away. But I felt a good sense of pride and a sense of accomplishment that we at least represented that aspect of the hobby very well internationally. You guys have any feelings about that? Did that matter much to you going in?
It was fun.
I didn't know. Yeah.
Phil, what were you going to say?
Oh, I didn't realize they had a best painted, to be honest. So I was trying really hard to get all my stuff out, and then I just borrowed a bunch from a friend, which was unbased, and a lot of it was like 2 to 3 color minimum kind of thing. So had I known that we, regardless of being in the running, I probably would have changed some of my army selections, or definitely would have painted some different stuff. But that may have been bad. It may have been a bad decision. So I'm gonna make sure I pack all my best stuff for next time, so that we can steal that first place painted, which I know we definitely have the gumption for.
So you're saying you're the reason we lost? Just kidding.
Yeah, actually, just to prepare you for it next year, guys, I threw it down with George, who was one of the studio painters that did a lot of the stuff for Montenegro. And first, I gave him a jibe that not all the guys individually painted their own stuff, but I also said that you've set the bar, and we're gonna gun for that next time around. So, not to compromise on picking the right units and making the armies in the right way, but we'll have enough lead time to paint the right stuff to a good standard as well. That's what I want to get showing. So anyway, that's one sort of thing about preparation for next year. I think that just is a secondary thing, but it's nice to be acknowledged for that at the very least. Okay, so Ryan, back to you. Sorry, I got you off track there about what preparations. And you spoke a lot about list building and how to compose a team, and I think all of that has super good value. We need to take that into account. I think I would add to that we need to, in a lot more ways, try to come together more commonly during the year, especially if we're going to select a team as far out as we did 6 months in advance, and force different situations that we play. Early in the conversation, Ryan, you touched on the idea that wouldn't it be cool, or wouldn't it be valuable if you played different armies, not just the Vermin Swarm exclusively and almost the same list exclusively for as much as you did. But what if you did, swap the table and play. For example, if you went and played with Kevin and his Saurian Ancients, what if you were in charge of the Saurian Ancients for the sake of a battle to try that out and experience it from that side? What do you think about doing games that way?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, at least especially as far as practice goes. And I think the other thing that's tangentially related to this point is that I think in hindsight, a lot of our lists were just suboptimal. Like mine in particular, looking at the variety of Vermin Swarm lists out there, mine was not great. They had a lot of soft spots. And so I think, by playing ETC and by spending a lot of time looking at other army lists, I've gotten a much better appreciation for list building, as well as we've got like nearly over 100 different lists to look at, so it's a real, like I've been playing around with some of Team Spain's lists because they won the whole thing. So they obviously did something right. And I've just been, since I've got back, I went back to my Sylvan Elves for a bit. I'm back to the Vermin Swarm again, but I played around with Team Spain's Sylvan Elf list. I'm like, this is a good list. And their Vermin Swarm list, I've been playing that a little bit with those few, minor tweaks of my own. But man, it's a good list. Like there's nothing soft. There's no easy points. And I kind of wish I had played a list like that all weekend. And so I think, yes, to your point, playing a more variety of stuff, giving each other more experience with more stuff, as well as better lists, and having like kind of, it's one thing to go find a bunch of lists on the internet. It's another thing to know that, hey, this list that I've got here, that won every single game at ETC. Okay, that means something, right? And seeing that guy use it and play it and knowing what they do is just a really valuable experience and something that I think we can leverage going forward.
Yeah. Phil, I know that you were part of this discussion with a couple other guys. Let's talk about the concept that we got introduced to us of training for ETC. Remember how that kept coming up with German guys and the guys from Belarus?
Yeah. A couple of guys had mentioned or asked how much we train at home, and then I can't remember who it was. I think it was like Doug or Bondi maybe. I kind of like looked at it and was like, well, we play one game a week, around work and like home life schedule, and they just kind of just a straight scoff at us. Just that's not practice. It's like that's for children. It's like you train 4 times a day, train 8 hours a week at minimum. So yeah, what we do is not training. We hobby play.
Yeah, and that was the distinction that I took away from that. Like they defined, no. We're not asking how much you play the game. That's not what we're asking. We're asking how much do you train for it. And to elaborate on what was meant by that sentiment was coming back to something I said a second ago. So if Ryan and Kevin get together and Kevin feels that he's really terrible against a certain structure of Wood Elf army or Sylvan Elf army, then the training session there would be, Ryan, please play this exact Sylvan Elf army that I have a lot of trouble with because I need to get better at reacting to that. It's that kind of sentiment is what they meant by training for it. And talking to both the German guys and the Spanish guys, what I remember that each of them said is, yeah, certainly for most of the year, they play on the weekends, get a couple games, maybe during the week as well. So they certainly play a little bit more frequently than a lot of us does. But when the 3 months prior to it, and when the team is chosen, and when it's time to lay it down and choose army lists, etc., they don't play games. That's training time, and they specifically set themselves up in scenarios that they need exposure to, which is back to what you were saying, Ryan, earlier, is we need to expose to much more variety of things or much more pointed things. So I think that's what we come away with the concept of training for ETC.
Yeah, I think if you want to be competitive and have a chance of doing well, you kind of got to do that. I mean, the word training is sometimes, maybe that's true, maybe it really is training, but I mean, you can still have fun while doing it. You just kind of have to have a different mindset, saying, I'm gonna do this thing that you're bad against, and you're probably gonna lose a bunch, but suck it up because you need to get better at this.
Yeah,
I think on that note too, a lot of them had mentioned the player pools. Like they were asking, like, how do you choose your team? Like, what is the criteria? And I remember Kevin and I looked at each other and just laughed and just said, like, well, Well, we had 8 people that could put up the money to get here, and like a lot of those guys just laughed and said, like, yeah, good point. Like we're proud of you for sending 8 people actually from Canada. And then a lot of them had 80 players, 90 players in a pool that are fighting to be on their team, and they have the infrastructure, the tournament infrastructure, just to play so many events, so many games, jam packed with people, that they're getting all kinds of great exposure. So I think that's something we need to really work on as well, like putting yourself in the hard positions, but and then just getting more people playing, because the more people we have playing locally, and we're 2 years behind the European scene for size and strength of community. The more people playing that we have, the more ideas people are coming up with. Because
Yeah.
to touch on what Ryan said previously about lists, is there's a lot of optimization that we can be learning from the European teams. But at the same time, there were a lot of really oddball lists I noticed for the factions that I play that did amazingly well, like 5 wins out of 6, 4 wins out of 6, that were not necessarily anything like the other lists in terms of units chosen, but in structure, where the like MSU mass durable units with scoring, and they were all doing excellent work, pulling a lot of weight in the hands that knew how to use them.
Right. And to add to what you said there, I think that as far as future plans, and making it to ETC, obviously the financial commitment has to be first and foremost. If you guys remember when I put out the call out, that was question one: are you prepared to put aside $3,000 ish for a European holiday? And that had to be question one. So that limited our pool. We did turn away some guys, so it wasn't just as little as 8 people, but it wasn't a whole lot more. But developing to the future, we can't obviously control people's ability to commit financially or commit the time, but we can certainly work on the pool of available players, which thus, by virtue of a secondary knock-on, can create those other 2 possibilities. So that's kind of what I want to think about going forward as far as a future aftermath of ETC is in your respective communities. And I might have you talk about this first, Ryan. What do you think the possibility of expanding player pool and getting more interest in an event like this has become?
Calgary's a tough community. Like, we have a really dedicated group of players, and that's all told is about 10 of us. And there's maybe about 5 or 6 more that are kind of on the periphery, like maybe as many as 10 if you add them all up. But getting that extra 10 out kind of regularly is challenging. So unfortunately, I don't know how much this experience has really done to add some dynamism to our Calgary scene. Partly, I think it's on the community structure, because we have not been great at running events over the last year and a half. And it's partly because Matt Lau and also Ryan, who no longer lives in Calgary, used to do a lot of the heavy lifting for the community and organizing events. And also Ryan's obviously no longer lives here, and Matt has been really bogged down with school. And so I think we haven't had the events that really kind of pull people out. And so, the hardcore players in Calgary have been going up to Edmonton, Red Deer, all the time. But for the players who aren't willing to do that, there hasn't been a lot for them to prepare for, or for a lot for them to get excited about. And I think if we want to build this community in Calgary, we need to do a better job of having events. Even if it's a 20-person event, let's do it. And if we have an event with enough communication in advance, we'll get 10 plus people from Edmonton, maybe a couple from Saskatchewan. So I think we just need to do a better job at having events locally. That way we can channel some of this energy into an event like that. And of the more hardcore players who didn't come to ETC, there's certainly some interest in going someday. So those guys are kind of excited about our experience, but on the whole, it hasn't done what we hoped for and kind of energizing people. Maybe longer term it will, but in the short term it hasn't, unfortunately.
Okay. And Phil, what's your perspective up in Edmonton and surrounding area?
I don't know. I'd say it's been a little more exciting after we got back than before we left, for sure. People seem to be kind of riding off the exposure that we were posting pictures and videos and stories and whatnot, kind of thing. But yeah, I find for myself, definitely, you really have to like, I don't even know how to describe it. You really just got to get like enough people interested to like kind of share your enthusiasm, and then just get them fired up in a way that they're like kind of resonating that with more and more and more people. Um, I never hosted events really at all ever until I found Ninth Age, and kind of made the conscious decision like, this is a really cool game. Like, this is, well, it is like my favorite game that I've played thus far. But thinking that this game is going to take a lot of nurturing and a lot of work to build a player base and a community and support it without having like a store structure or a marketing campaign behind it. But it's definitely worth it, definitely. And I think Ryan makes a good point that we just need to get a little bit more structure and a little bit more help, maybe to the guys down south, to get like some set events going. And I think once we do, and like he said, we get some guys from Edmonton and Saskatchewan coming out, it'll be really good, really great for the community, because that's what it's all about, really, is exposure. And the more people seeing it, more people will want to try it, and that'll just kind of exponentially help itself.
Yeah. So I think I would encapsulate that by saying that the truth is, despite the fact that we feel like we did well enough to put together a team out of our communities here in Alberta, predominantly, with the exception of Lawrence being from Vancouver, I think that we still have to admit that it's a community that needs nurturing. I think it still needs development, and its player base needs to grow. So certainly my feelings coming back is there was interest from a handful of guys about, that seems like a really cool experience. I think I would like to go to that in the future. And what does it take to get there? So I'm getting a lot more questions about that from a handful of people, not from a great deal of people. But I think that, again, that says to me that doing these sort of inclusive types of events are going to be necessary still. And that leads back to what we were talking about being competitive and owning lists and doing that kind of thing. That's still step 2 for us in Edmonton and Calgary. I think getting to the point where we're making really competitive players still is secondary to accumulating more massive players in general. That's how I feel about things. Anything more you guys want to add to that sentiment or a rebuttal to that thought?
Yeah,
I definitely think that's fair.
Go ahead, Phil.
Go ahead. Okay, sure. Yeah, like in a game that's always going to be, I guess, kind of like singled out for having to try twice as hard to get people to come into it. I think you're definitely right that building community has to be first and foremost on most of our minds. Or at least always in the background should be a factor. But I think once people do get into it, and we need to do maybe a better job of showing people how easy it can be, because it looks very daunting from the outside. They'll be really rewarded, though, I think, once they pick it up and once they start playing it. It's just an excellent experience for sure. You were saying, Ryan?
Yeah, Kieran's point about growing the community first and foremost, I think that's a very valid point. And we have to, especially in Calgary, like there's people who will come out to things if we host them. So we need to just have events. I think typically the type of player going to pull into the Ninth Age will be a little bit more of a competitive player. So I think, yeah, like we're not trying to scare people away by being ultra competitive and taking things way too seriously and not having fun. Totally agree with that sentiment. But I think, unlike other games from a company that won't be named, there's no such thing as like the best thing in the game that you just spend money on and it's better than everything else and everybody frowns upon you for bringing it out. The Ninth Age is a pretty darn balanced game. There's no real obvious net list for most armies, and most units are reasonably well balanced. Yeah, sure, there's certain combinations that are better than others that kind of have more synergy, but for the most part, you're not talking about game-breaking stuff. So, I think just people who come into the game who actually will play it, will realize that, and it kind of just allows for a slightly more competitive thing than let's say maybe 8th edition fantasy, where there was some stuff that was just clearly better than others, and if you took it, you were like the bad guy. It's just not really true about 9th Age. Like, there's nothing that you can say, oh well, that's auto win, because there isn't. So I think you can balance both a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that a couple things that I want to highlight as we sort of come to a close here is, I know that you, Ryan, have launched a couple of leagues with the 9th Age in Calgary, and I understand that you're about to launch another one pretty soon. Isn't that right?
Yeah. So the registration deadline is this Sunday. Or if someone sees this video a couple days late and want to get in late, I will make an exception for them. but yeah, so there's a league just about to start. It's pretty casual. You'll play one game every 2 weeks against a defined opponent, and it's just kind of a great way to get in, have some games, play with people who across the city who you might not have you might not be able to make out to our typical Wednesday night. So you can come out and play. It's a fun way to play, and we're actually getting prepared to announce in a tournament too. Maybe within the next 2 weeks to a month, we'll have a date in mind.
Oh, good news. Okay, so where do people go to look out for that?
Yeah, so we have a Facebook page whose name recently changed because the store we used to play at is no longer in existence. So you can find us on the 9th Age forums. My name there is Black Lancer, so you can send me a message, or find our Facebook page, which is now called 9th Age Ogre's Den League.
Okay. And then, of course, we have Alberta 9th Age Facebook page that we both generally use. Up here in Edmonton, Phil, as you touched on earlier, we've just launched into our own campaign league run by Doug Lamb, one of our teammates. And we capped that at 16 players. I'm happy to say that we actually, well, not happy to say that we turned people away, but happy to say that we got the capacity on that one. And that'll be going over the next little bit. But the other thing that I wanted to touch on, as far as what we just briefly talked about of building a competitive player, something that Phil and I talked about on our way back from the ETC is, although we want to nurture more players to come in, there's certainly no reason we can't have a bit of a different conversation with somebody who wants to play that ETC sort of style, rather than just, what we take as a casual fun game. We can certainly have those conversations now with some people if they want to develop those skills. Do you want to add any final thoughts to that, Phil? If you're still there and not on mute.
Oh, sorry, are you asking that, Kieran? My internet's breaking up here.
Yeah, I was asking just if you had any final thoughts about developing player base versus developing competitive base.
Sorry, say again. Any developing competitive things?
Developing player base versus developing competitive base.
Oh, sorry, he's breaking up. Player base versus competitive base. I think people have been doing a good job of not encroaching too much on the general enthusiasm and general fun that people have been trying to promote. I find a lot of our competitive players do get pigeonholed with people saying like they're always going to win, they're always going to be the best. But I've noticed a lot of players in general are creeping up to the point now where they're eking out wins, or they're holding their own in situations where a year ago none of them felt that they would have had a chance. So I think we're doing a really good job of integrating more competitive play, more interesting list dynamics and stuff like that smoothly, and it hasn't been like a shock. I haven't had anybody at the end of a tournament say they had a terrible time, even if they've lost all their games. I'm always, making sure to double check that they had a good time, a good experience, and so far it seems to be that's been the case, which is excellent to see.
All right. Well, I think at that, guys, we'll wrap up. That was certainly a really good in-depth chat about the experience in Zagreb and through the ETC. I think the final thoughts that I want to put forward when we sort of think ahead to future ETCs, to any of those of you watching that are in our Alberta community, certainly we'd like you to reach out to us through those channels that Ryan mentioned, and let's get you playing. If you have a penchant for playing more competitive style, those of us that went there are certainly happy to share our thoughts with you and take you through that kind of development. For those watching this from further afield, if you're in Canada and you want to be a part of future ETC, then certainly work on your own communities, like in some of the suggestions that we made here. Reach out to us, and certainly when the time comes over the next few months that we look forward to assembling a team for going to Serbia for 2019, it would be wonderful to have the fruits of a whole nation available to us to choose players from. So please reach out that way. Any final thoughts, Phil?
Yeah. On the point of that, I've been visiting a little bit with some guys in the Ontario page and the Saskatchewan areas, and I just want to make sure that everybody that sees this knows that there are some fairly large events, whether they're a little far away from you or not. Like we have one coming up this November, a team event, and our 9th age spot sold out and then overflowed. So we had spot for 8 3-man teams, expanded to 10, and then we actually had 2 more teams that wanted to sign up, but we just don't have the hall space for it this time, unfortunately. And then earlier this year, we had 40 people show up for a 4-man team event. So there are some big events, which is really awesome and exciting to see. And there should be only more and more popping up. So if you're getting discouraged, and you're not having a lot of luck putting stuff together in your local environment, maybe reach out your scope a little bit wider and try and come out to some of the other ones in Canada. Meet some more people and make some more inroads there.
Yeah, I think if you're from outside of Alberta, it would be great, and you want to play on the ETC team, if you could make it out to one of our local events, which I realize in Canada is a difficult commitment because it's such a long flight and expensive. But I think that's a really good way to kind of build a Canadian-wide community. If you show up at our event, maybe some of us will show up at your event a few months down the road, because it'd be really cool if we could build a cross-Canada thing and kind of build the player base, because, in order to compete with some of these European teams and their player base, we're going to have to grow it and kind of leverage the whole country. So maybe we can cross-pollinate each other's events a little bit. It'd be a nice thing.
That's a good way to put it, right? Okay. Well, guys, thanks for your thoughts and great discussion here. And I also want to close with the sentiment that it was wonderful to spend a whole week with you guys across in Croatia, doing the things that we love together. And I hope to certainly do some more of that in the future years. Okay.
Agreed. So that was awesome.
Cheers. With that, I'll say farewell to the internets and to you guys for tonight.